Willibald Bianchi no longer exists as a symbol. He is remembered as a man who lived an ordinary life, made a critical choice, survived what followed, and then disappeared into systems that failed to notice him. The Medal of Honor cannot replace a grave. It never could. Honor cannot shorten the wait, and recognition cannot replace presence. What remains is both simple and hard-won. A name taken from a body, then returned. A family that waited longer than a lifetime. The waiting only ends when someone can say clearly and exactly, "This is him, and this is where he rests." I've spent years telling stories about heroes, but Bianchi's story haunts me differently, because it forces us to ask, what good is being remembered if you can't be found? Before Willibald Charles Bianchi's name was carved into history, he was simply a young man who woke early and never wasted time. This was the late 1930s in Minnesota. The state rewarded men like that, not with praise, but with the quiet expectation that work done well was its own justification. The streets where Bianchi grew up were narrow and plain. Houses stood close together, near enough that voices carried through open windows in summer, and coal smoke clung to everything in winter. People noticed who showed up and who didn't. Reputation traveled faster than money. When I imagine these streets, I see my own grandfather's neighborhood. Different city. Same understanding. You proved yourself through showing up, not through speaking up. Bianchi's parents were immigrants. They rarely spoke about where they'd left. The past, in their understanding, was something to leave behind, not something to return to. Work was spoken of with respect. Complaints were not. His mother kept the small house tidy. She wiped down the table every evening, even when it seemed no one noticed. She saved string. She reused envelopes. She folded letters carefully and kept them. There's something profoundly moving about this detail and the careful folding, the preservation. She was already preparing to hold on to pieces of him before she knew she'd need to. Bianchi learned to repair instead of replace from an early age. He learned to tighten loose hinges, sharpen dull blades, sew fabric so the seam held. His hands became rough quickly. By the time he graduated, his knuckles carried small scars from tools that slipped. He never mentioned them. They were part of the work. Before enlisting, his daily life ran on routine. He woke before dawn, washed his face with cold water, dressed quickly. Breakfast was whatever his mother left warming on the stove. He ate standing up sometimes, already thinking about the day ahead. He left the house before the sun climbed high, the familiar sound of the closing door unremarkable and expected. Each evening, he returned home tired but not exhausted. He washed up, ate, and sat at the small table in the kitchen. Sometimes he mended his own clothes, the needle moving steadily through fabric. He didn't enjoy mending. He did it because it needed doing. He pulled the thread tight so buttons wouldn't come loose again. There was satisfaction in completing something properly, even when no one praised it. This is what gets me about Bianchi. He wasn't preparing to be extraordinary. He was just learning to be reliable. And somehow, that's what made him capable of what came later. He didn't talk much about feelings. When something bothered him, he adapted rather than complained. This wasn't false stoicism. It was habit. On his wrist, he wore a simple watch. Nothing fancy. It kept accurate time, nothing more. He checked it regularly, not from impatience, but to know where he stood in the day's progression. For him, time was something to be managed carefully. That watch becomes so important later. It's the thread connecting his civilian life to everything that follows. The relationship between him and his mother was built on daily routine rather than deep conversations. They talked about practical matters, food prices, neighbors, things needing repair around the house. When something serious happened, they addressed it indirectly. They didn't name the fear. They found ways around it. Every week, without fail, he wrote to her. The handwriting was neat, even, orderly. He didn't crowd the page. Margins were strictly observed. Lines stayed straight, as if guided by an invisible rule. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He just reported what happened. One letter from that period survives, worn thin from repeated reading. "I'm doing fine. Don't worry. I just want to come home soon." That simple. It wasn't written to be memorable. It was written to reassure. I keep coming back to this letter. 9 words that promised everything and revealed nothing. The restraint in it breaks my heart. His mother read the letters slowly, sometimes aloud. She focused on the tone more than the content. After finishing, she placed each letter in a small tin box, arranged carefully, oldest on the bottom. The box fit in the cupboard next to the flour tin. When Bianchi joined the military, it wasn't because he dreamed of combat. It was because the military offered stability, steady pay. It was a practical decision, a way to contribute without drifting, a way to send money home. When others talked about glory, he waved it off. "Just a job," he'd say in an even tone. "Same as any other. Just farther from home." In training, he followed instructions well. He wasn't loud, but he wasn't invisible either. He noticed small details others missed. A strap that rubbed and could cause blisters, a buckle that might cut if not adjusted properly. When equipment broke, he fixed it without comment. He wore his uniform plainly, boots laced tight, sleeves clean. He wrote letters about ordinary things. The smell of the barracks after rain. The weight of a rifle after hours of drill. He didn't write directly about fear, but it was there, in what he avoided saying. His specific fear wasn't pain, it was erasure. This realization hits differently when you know how the story ends. His fear was prophetic. He was afraid of dying somewhere no one could point to on a map and say, "He's here." He'd seen how easily names disappeared when paperwork replaced people. Before shipping out, he walked the neighborhood one last time. He nodded to people who recognized him in uniform. They said they were proud of him. The word embarrassed him. Pride seemed like something earned after completing something. He hadn't completed anything yet. That evening, he sat longer than usual at the kitchen table with his mother. She asked if he needed to pack anything else. Socks, soap, extra writing paper. He shook his head to each question. "You'll write," she said. "Yes," he answered. His voice wasn't dramatic. It was definite. "Every week?" "Yes." When he left, she stood in the doorway until he disappeared down the street. Then she adjusted the tin box in the cupboard so it sat straight. Bianchi boarded the transport carrying only his uniform, his watch, and his habit of writing. He carried a modest hope to return home, find steady work in transportation, build a life that didn't need explaining. What he didn't know, what no one told him, was how fragile ordinary life becomes when interrupted. At that point, he wasn't a hero yet. He was just someone who showed up on time, fixed what broke, and wrote home every week. That was enough. It began with heat already rising from the ground and air so heavy that breathing felt like work. At Bagak, the terrain offered no favors. Vegetation grew sparse where artillery had passed through. The ground was cracked and uneven, churned by boots, shell fire, and weeks of retreat. The men moved with the caution of people who knew the day would demand something from them, but didn't yet know how much. Willibald C. Bianchi checked his watch just after dawn broke. It was a habit from civilian life, a small way to maintain order, the watch. Face was scratched. Condensation sat under the glass. He pulled his sleeve down and focused forward. Time, previously measured in hours and shifts, now compressed into minutes between movements. Orders arrived in fragments. Hold this position. Cover the retreat. Delay, not defeat. The objective was no longer victory in the conventional sense. It was time. Time for others to act. Time to prevent collapse from becoming panic. Bianchi understood this without explanation. He'd watched the defensive line contract over days. He'd seen men abandon positions they'd sworn never to leave. The Japanese advance had come close enough that sound arrived before sight. Rifle fire crackled. Machine gun bursts echoed through tree canopy without clear rhythm. Explosions grew louder up the slope, followed by strange silences that didn't last long. The smell of gunpowder mixed with damp earth and sweat. Communication became difficult. Words drowned in noise. Gestures replaced orders. I've read dozens of battle accounts, but there's something particularly brutal about knowing the strategic situation, that what you're fighting for isn't victory, just minutes. Bianchi moved with his unit, staying low, adjusting position to match the rough terrain. His left hand already ached from earlier strain, fingers stiff from gripping metal too long. He ignored it. Discomfort was now constant. It was no longer treated as a warning, just background sensation. The first bullet arrived without hesitation. It struck his left arm hard, dislocating his shoulder. Pain came fierce and immediate, hotter than he'd imagined. His hand shook for a moment. Blood spread quickly through his sleeve, dark against the fabric. He gritted his teeth and shifted his weight, trying to stay balanced. Someone shouted his name. The sound carried urgency and disbelief. "You're hit." He glanced down once, assessing damage with the same care he'd use on broken equipment. He could still move his fingers. He could still fire. He nodded, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement of fact. The decision not to retreat wasn't sudden. It was practical. He understood what leaving at that moment would mean. The defensive line was already thin. The movement behind him depended on resistance here. He adjusted position and kept firing. This is what heroism actually looks like, not dramatic speeches or grand gestures, just a man doing math in his head. If I leave, more people die. The second wound came shortly after, this time hitting his chest and making breathing difficult. The impact pushed him back against cover. His vision narrowed for a moment. Sound became muffled, as if he were underwater. He forced himself to breathe shallow until everything sharpened again. A medic moved toward him, then hesitated as gunfire intensified. Bianchi waved him off with his uninjured hand. "I can still stand," he said. The words came strained but steady. They weren't meant to reassure. They were meant to end the discussion. He continued, firing. Slower now, more deliberate. Each movement sent pain radiating outward, but he kept his breathing controlled and focused on executing the motion. Blood soaked his sleeve and dripped from his fingers. He wiped his hand on his pants without looking, leaving a dark streak, then moved forward again. As ammunition ran low and pressure mounted, someone gave the order to fall back. Soldiers began retreating in short bursts, crouching low, running when possible. Bianchi saw the gap opening in the formation, and understood the risk. If no one held position, even briefly, the retreat would become chaos. Nearby, a tank sat partially hidden, its metal sides already hot from use. Smoke rose from the open hatch. The tank had been hit earlier and couldn't move, but it offered cover and a firing position. Bianchi didn't wait for instruction. He climbed up, using his right hand to pull himself forward, boots slipping once on the scorched metal before finding purchase. Inside, heat hit immediately. The air stank of oil and burned metal. Interior surfaces were hot enough to blister skin. He positioned himself where he could fire outward, leaning against the tank's frame. Another round struck him, this time hard enough to knock him into the interior wall. The impact shook his entire body. Pain tore through his chest. He went down for a moment, then forced himself upright, breathing ragged, teeth clenched. He felt his heartbeat pounding and rapid. He recognized that each breath hurt more than the one before. He also recognized that there were still men moving behind him. That recognition mattered more. Think about this. 3 bullets in his body, inside a metal furnace. And what keeps him upright isn't courage in the abstract. It's just seeing men still running. He fired until his hands shook too much to reload smoothly. When his grip weakened, he propped the rifle against the edge and squeezed the trigger with what strength remained. The hot metal burned his skin. He ignored it. Outside, fighting continued. A few men looked back and saw him still firing. They kept moving, that was the point. Time both stretched and contracted simultaneously. Minutes seemed to last forever. Long enough that doubt crept in. Long enough that fear became tangible. His fear wasn't of pain. It was of falling too soon. Of dying silent before the movement behind him finished. At some point, hands grabbed him. "We've got you." "Easy. Don't move." He didn't remember how he got out of the tank. He remembered being lowered down, the ground cold against his back despite the heat. He remembered the sky, bright but hopeless. He remembered thinking about the watch, still on his wrist, still ticking. The next thought surprised him with its ordinariness. "I won't be able to write this week. The promise broken." Even then, bleeding out on Philippine soil, what haunted him was failing to keep his word to his mother. He was evacuated under fire, carried by soldiers who stumbled, cursed, and refused to let go. Each step jolted his body. He drifted in and out, catching only fragments of disjointed conversation. "We're running out of supplies." "Hold him steady. Watch the bleeding." Someone whispered prayers. Someone else cursed the terrain. Smoke followed them. When he came fully conscious later, he was lying under canvas shelter. His wounds had been bandaged hastily. Pain came in waves, but strength didn't. He focused on staying conscious, on answering when asked. In the following hours, Bagak continued to collapse. Positions were abandoned. Orders changed. Resistance gave way to retreat. Bianchi survived long enough to understand that what he'd held would be lost regardless. That knowledge didn't diminish the decision he'd made. It clarified its purpose. Later reports described his actions with words like extraordinary and conspicuous gallantry. The citation noted that he'd been wounded multiple times, but continued fighting. It was written tersely, carefully, as if courage could be summarized. At the moment itself, such language didn't exist. There was only one choice: not to step back. The wounds didn't end his military career. They marked him. Recovery was incomplete. Pain persisted. Strength returned unevenly. He wore the uniform long enough to witness the larger collapse of Bataan and the surrender that followed. The context of his action shifted almost immediately from defense to defeat. When the war turned, he stood among men who'd watched him bleed and refused to leave. No one mentioned medals. They talked about water, about food, about the road ahead. One man looked at him and said quietly, not in accusation, just in tired voice, "You should have gone back." Bianchi shook his head once. His voice was barely audible. Not yet. The decision at Bagak followed him into captivity. It shaped how others saw him and how he carried himself among them. That day, he'd learned the body's limits before collapse. He'd also learned something else. That choosing to stay didn't guarantee survival, only consequence. What Bagak proved wasn't that he lacked fear. It proved that when forced to decide, he'd chosen others over himself. That choice brought him recognition later, but it also brought him into circumstances where recognition had no value. The question that remained after that day wasn't whether his actions were heroic. It was what happened to a man who survived such actions. Whether courage offered protection or merely delayed loss. The answer waited on the other side of the battlefield, in a future where his name would be separated from his body and stored somewhere else, where courage would be acknowledged, but his presence would be forgotten. The Battle of Bagak was the moment Bianchi spent what remained of his strength. The cost couldn't be collected immediately. It would follow him through captivity, onto an unmarked ship, and to a death no one would find for decades. But that morning, all of that remained invisible. There was only the heat, the noise, the pain, and a decision made without ceremony. And there was a man who didn't step back when he still could. The end of fighting didn't feel like an actual ending. When Bataan fell, the noise of battle stopped suddenly, as if someone had closed a door. What replaced it was something quieter and more dangerous. Orders delivered without explanation, movement without purpose, compliance stripped of meaning. The structure that had shaped the previous days collapsed into a single command: move forward. Willibald C. Bianchi was still alive when they surrendered. He was no longer whole. His body carried wounds that had been sutured just enough to let him stand, but not enough to let him forget. Pain followed him constantly, most intense when he tried to ignore it. He didn't talk about it. He'd learned that pain, once named, demanded attention he couldn't afford to give. The march began almost immediately. Men were assembled, counted, and pushed onto the road. There was no ceremony, no explanation of distance, no indication how long the journey would last. The road was pale and dry, dust rising with each step and clinging to sweat-slick skin. The sun beat down without pause. Shade was rare and existed only briefly. I've walked in heat before, but I've never walked wounded, starving, with no end in sight. The Bataan Death March wasn't metaphorical. It was exactly what it sounds like. Footwear failed first. Soles wore thin, then cracked. Leather softened and tore. Feet blistered, then bled. Bianchi adjusted his stride to reduce pressure on the raw spots, shortening his steps when possible. He didn't remove his boots. He knew better than to let skin touch that brutal ground directly. The watch remained on his wrist. Scratched now, the face clouded. He checked it once on the first day, then less frequently. Time had changed shape. It was no longer divided into hours or shifts. It became hunger, thirst, exhaustion, pain. Morning and evening felt identical in the body. As days passed, men spoke less. Initially, they asked questions. How far? Where? When would food come? The questions went unanswered. Eventually, speech served only functional purposes. Water ahead. Don't sit down. Keep moving. Names were exchanged at first, then quickly forgotten. Memory became selective. Bianchi remembered a man's breathing before he remembered his name. He remembered who walked unsteadily, who needed support, who would fall if left alone. When rations were distributed, they weren't enough and weren't regular. Bianchi divided his portion multiple times, passing some to soldiers beginning to fail. He didn't announce the action. He placed food in waiting hands and kept walking. This detail destroys me. Already starving, already wounded, and still he gave food away, because he saw what was coming before others did. Eat, he'd said once to a young man whose hands shook too much to hold anything. I can manage. The boy looked at him as if uncertain whether to argue. Then he ate quickly, as if afraid the offer would be withdrawn. Bianchi carried very little now. Anything unnecessary had been stripped away, sold, or lost. Only the watch remained. It was the single thing connecting him to a life of predictability. Even when he stopped checking the time, he wore it, the band softened by years of use. At night, when the column was allowed to stop, bodies dropped where they stood. There was no room for comfort. Men slept, pressed together, sharing warmth without speaking. Bianchi slept poorly. Pain made stillness difficult. He shifted often, careful not to disturb others. Sometimes he counted breaths, not in prayer, but to stay present in each moment. He thought about his mother's kitchen, the chair by the table facing the window, the tin box in the cupboard where she kept his letters. He imagined it growing heavier with time, not from new letters, but from waiting. The letters had stopped during the march. Not because he chose to stop writing, but because paper had disappeared. Because the strength in his fingers was needed for balance, not for holding pencils. Because writing required a future, and the march required only endurance. The promise he'd made to write every week had been broken without mercy. That failure haunted him more than the wounds. It wasn't a moral failure. It was a physical one. But the distinction didn't matter to him. Eventually, the march ended. Not in liberation, but in confinement. Camps replaced roads. Barbed wire replaced horizons. Inside the camps, daily life returned, but in distorted form. Wake up. Roll call. Work. Roll call again. Food came irregularly and was never enough. Illness spread through barracks faster than rumor. Bianchi's body, already weakened, resisted poorly. Fever came and went. Weakness persisted. His left arm never fully recovered. He compensated silently by shifting weight, adjusting how he gripped things, rationing movement. He was no longer known for his achievements at Bagak. That knowledge belonged to a different life. Here, he was known for smaller things, for sharing food, for supporting men who collapsed, for staying calm when panic spread. When someone died in the night, he helped move the body aside so mourning count could be accurate. Official language had simplified death into accounting. Human language failed completely. The injustice was continuous and compounding. Men who'd survived bullets were destroyed by indifference. Records were incomplete. Names were misspelled. Camp transfers happened without explanation. At times, Bianchi and others were moved again, conditions worsening after each relocation. Footwear rotted, skin peeled. The gap between what was recorded and what was actually experienced widened. Rumors spread. Transport ships, movement north, labor elsewhere. No one explained details. Guards didn't answer questions. When the final order came, it arrived. Abruptly. Prisoners were marched to a dock and loaded onto a ship. The ship bore no markings indicating prisoners of war. No Red Cross. No signal visible from the air. It was an oversight in procedure, not momentary cruelty. The distinction mattered little to those forced below deck. This is where the cruelty becomes almost unbearable. American planes bombed this ship. Our own forces killed our own men because no one thought to mark the ship properly. Inside, space disappeared. Heat became unbearable. Air thickened with breath and waste. People sat pressed together, knees pulled up, taking turns lying down when someone lost consciousness. Thirst returned quickly. Hunger intensified. Voices changed pitch as bodies weakened. Bianchi often stood near younger prisoners when possible, supporting them as the ship rocked. He spoke quietly, repeating familiar phrases. "Hold on. Breathe slow." He didn't talk about the future. He talked about the next hour, the next breath. The watch remained, on his wrist. Moisture had seeped inside. The face clouded, numbers blurring until he wiped it clean with his sleeve. Eventually, he stopped checking it entirely. Time on the ship was measured by suffering, not minutes. What happened next had no drama. There was no warning shouted below deck, no chance to prepare. When the bombing came, it arrived as impact, darkness, and water rushing where air had been. Bombs do what bombs do. They don't ask who's inside. The Anura Maru sank in January 1945. Bianchi did not survive. He died among other prisoners whose names were never fully recorded. His body was not returned home. No grave marker was placed for him. Later, remains were found and buried under the designation unknown, along with others whose identities had been lost in transport, in explosion, or in paperwork. Silence followed immediately and completely. For those who lived, what came next wasn't resolution, just notification. For Bianchi's mother, silence began the moment her son's letters stopped arriving. It hardened when the official notification came, and it never truly ended. The war ended for the country long before it ended for Willibald C. Bianchi's family. In Minnesota, victory arrived with shouting. Church bells rang. Newspapers printed headlines large enough to read from a distance. Parades moved through towns that had learned to ration quietly and now learned to celebrate again. Men returned home in uniforms fading from memory. Some talked eagerly. Others barely spoke. Streets filled, then emptied. Life restructured itself around peace. For Bianchi's mother, nothing rearranged itself at all. The waiting hadn't ended. It had simply lost its original context. The official notification arrived in January 1945. It came through the mail, folded neatly, typed in language that sounded practiced, distant and careful, promising nothing. The notice stated that Captain Willibald Charles Bianchi had died while a prisoner of war. It didn't specify cause. It didn't specify location. It didn't say whether anyone had seen his body, whether he'd been buried, or whether anything identifiable remained. She read the letter standing at the kitchen table. She read it again, slower, tracing each line with her eyes, as if careful attention might reveal something hidden. It didn't. The words remained immobile, unresponsive. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully, aligning the edges, and placed it in the tin box where she'd kept her son's letters from the beginning of the war. Only after that did she sit down. I think about her reading that letter. How steady her hands must have been. How automatic the folding. Because if she let herself feel it all at once, she'd collapse. People came when they heard. Neighbors brought casseroles wrapped in cloth. Some brought flowers. Some brought silence. Most brought phrases they'd learned to say to mothers like her. At least now you know. He was very brave. The war is finally over. She nodded when expected. She thanked them when they left. She didn't argue, but after the door closed, she returned to the table and looked at the empty chair across from her. Knowing her son was dead didn't tell her where he was. It didn't give her a place to stand and say his name out loud. The next morning, she checked the mailbox. She did it again in the afternoon. The habit continued. She began writing letters. Initially, they were careful and formal. She addressed officers by full title. She used her son's complete rank and service number. She asked where her son was buried. She asked if any personal effects needed to be returned. She asked if anyone had been with her son in his final moments. Responses came slowly. When they arrived, they repeated the same phrases. Remains not recovered. Presumed deceased. No further information available at this time. She wrote again and again. This is what devastates me most. Not the death itself, but this. A mother writing, letters into a void, year after year, getting nothing back. Months passed, then years. Each response was gentler than the one before, not because it mattered less, but because it contained less. Eventually, responses stopped completely. Silence replaced repetition. The Medal of Honor was awarded later. It came in a fabric-lined box. Inside were instructions, an invitation to a ceremony. Words about courage and valor that she read easily. She believed them. She'd never doubted her son's courage. But the medal didn't answer any of her questions. She held it in her hands and found it strangely durable. The metal didn't bend, it didn't age, it didn't soften like paper. She placed it in the cupboard beside the tin box. Sometimes she took it out and polished it with a cloth. It stayed cool and unchanging. It didn't tell her where her son was. In the kitchen, his chair remained in its old position. She didn't move it. She didn't clear space around it either. The emptiness became part of the room. Mornings were hardest. She still woke early, still glanced toward the door, still listened for footsteps that would never come. She continued checking the mailbox. Once in the morning, once in the afternoon. Years passed, and the habit didn't change. Even after she understood that no letter would come explaining where her son rested, the act of checking helped her through the waiting. Stopping would mean admitting something she wasn't ready to accept. Without a grave, grief couldn't settle. There was no funeral date to mark its end, no ground to touch, no headstone to clean. The pain didn't move forward. It repeated. Officially, her son had been honored, but privately, he remained suspended, not fully present and not fully gone. The injustice was quiet but persistent. A person could receive the nation's highest military honor and still have nowhere to belong. Time passed, and people who'd known Bianchi before the war began dying. Neighbors moved elsewhere, street names changed. Factories closed or reopened under different ownership. Fewer people remembered the young man in uniform who'd walked these streets. Many knew only that an older woman lived alone and checked the mail often. Years later, when asked about her son, she always answered the same way. He didn't come home. She didn't say died. Death without a specified location felt incomplete. These 3 words carry the weight of 80 years. He didn't come home. Not he died, not he was killed. Because those words implied an ending she couldn't reach. Elsewhere, other families experienced similar versions of waiting. Parents and siblings of men lost at sea or in camps learned to speak about absence in ways that didn't invite questions. They learned which dates to remember and which to let pass quietly. Men who survived the camps and the transport ships carried fragmentary memories. One former prisoner, now elderly, spoke about Bianchi years later when asked by a researcher. He remembered a man who shared food and stayed calm when others panicked. He remembered the watch on his wrist. He didn't know what happened to him after the ship was hit. No one did. Survival was too small a concern to allow tracking anything else. The decades passed unevenly. In the late 1940s, military records were transferred, consolidated, and reclassified. In the process, many were lost. Names were misspelled. Burial locations were recorded vaguely or not at all. Unknown remains were grouped together and numbered instead of identified. The work was administrative, not malicious, but the consequences lasted. Bianchi's name was eventually carved on the walls of the missing at the American Cemetery in Manila. Stone replaced flesh. The wall acknowledged what the military knew and what they didn't. It confirmed that he'd died and admitted that his body hadn't been found. For visitors, the wall was a place to reflect. For his family, it was a compromise. A name without a grave. A location that wasn't a resting place. She visited whenever possible. She traced the letters of his name with her fingers. She spoke quietly to the stone, as if it might carry sound somewhere useful. When she left, she carried nothing away. There was nothing to carry. She aged slowly. Her daily life narrowed. Checking the mailbox became less frequent, as walking became difficult. The tin box remained in the cupboard. When she died, it was found exactly where she'd kept it. Inside were the letters arranged carefully, the official notification folded among them, and no message explaining how to live with waiting that never gets answered. After she died, the family story condensed. He was lost in the war. The phrase replaced detail. It was easier for others to understand. The injustice softened with time, but it never disappeared. Each generation inherited a smaller piece of the uncertainty. Meanwhile, science continued advancing. DNA was no longer just theory. Databases expanded. Unknown remains were recatalogued. Cemeteries were reconsidered with new questions, but progress was slow. Cases like Bianchi's weren't discovered quickly. There were too many, and each required years of patient work. The rows of identical headstones standing abroad symbolized decisions made under pressure and never corrected. Each headstone marked not just a death, but a failure to recognize who that person was. The system that failed to help him even after death didn't automatically fix itself. It required individuals to notice inconsistencies, to reopen officially closed files, to spend careers reconciling bones with paperwork. That long wait wasn't passive. For families, it manifested in anniversaries marked without certainty. in hesitation before using the word closure, in the recognition that something essential had been postponed indefinitely. What made the wait especially unjust was that it continued after peace was restored. Victory didn't bring bodies home. Honor didn't guarantee remembrance. Through artifacts, institutions moved forward. Families remained. For over 80 years, Willibald C. Bianchi remained officially known, but physically missing. He existed as a citation, a name on a wall, a medal in a box. He didn't exist as a grave with dates clearly carved in stone. That contradiction persisted not because no one cared, but because care alone couldn't compensate for what had been lost in bombing, in transport, in paperwork, and in time. The question that remained open through those decades was simple and unanswered. How long should a family have to wait for a place to stand and say goodbye? The process of discovery didn't begin with revelation. It began with discomfort. At the Defense Prisoner of War Missing in Action Accounting Agency, discomfort is often the first signal that a file needs reopening. A record that doesn't sit right. A set of documents arranged too neatly without ever being examined. A name placed in a category out of necessity rather than certainty. Willibald Charles Bianchi's case was one of those. For decades, he'd been officially declared dead. That fact was no longer in question. What remained unresolved was the matter of identification, whether his remains had ever been definitively connected to his name. This distinction mattered only to a small group who understood the significance of burying someone as unknown and leaving them that way. After World War II, such distinctions were unavoidable. Recovery teams faced staggering numbers. Bodies were found underwater, at bombed docks, in mass graves, and at temporary burial sites. Identification relied on what could be found quickly: dog tags, clothing fragments, dental records, unit location. When those methods failed, remains were grouped and buried under neutral markers. It wasn't negligence. It was triage. The underlying assumption behind those decisions was simple. Time and technology wouldn't be sufficient to improve outcomes. The unknown would remain unknown. But here's where the story shifts. Here's where decades of waiting meets modern science. By the early 21st century, that assumption was no longer true. DNA analysis had fundamentally changed forensic identification. Bone fragments, once considered unusable, now carried information. Family reference samples, collected years earlier without guaranteed results, were still preserved. Databases expanded. Computing power increased. What was once impossible became merely difficult. This is where science becomes hope. Where technology finally catches up to promises we couldn't keep 80 years ago. At DPAA, analysts began a systematic review of unresolved losses connected to Japanese transport ships bombed in early 1945. The sinking of the Enora Maru kept appearing, not because it was well documented, but because it was poorly documented across multiple independent sources. American bombing reports recorded an attack on a ship at a specific time and place. Japanese POW movement logs listed transfers matching that time frame. Post-war recovery summaries mentioned unidentified remains found in the area. No single record contradicted the others completely. They simply didn't align clearly. That discrepancy mattered. A review board flagged the case for reconsideration. The decision was made procedurally, not emotionally. No one involved awarded the medal or wrote about heroism. At this stage, Bianchi was no longer a story. He was a data problem that had never been properly examined with modern tools. But the clock was ticking. Every year that passed meant fewer family members who remembered, fewer samples to compare, fewer witnesses who might fill in gaps. Later, exhumation was approved. Physical work began quietly, without advance notice. At an overseas cemetery, rows of identical headstones were all inscribed "Unknown." Each headstone represented a decision made under pressure decades earlier. Excavation proceeded with extreme care. Soil was removed incrementally. Each fragment was photographed, measured, and documented. Provenance was recorded precisely. Nothing was assumed. Nothing was rushed. Remains were transported to a laboratory where context mattered as much as composition. Analysis began with the physical. A femur showed signs of healed trauma. The pattern matched gunshot wounds from years earlier that had been survived. That detail helped narrow the search, but didn't identify anyone. Other bones showed evidence of prolonged malnutrition and physical stress. Teeth were examined for wear, restorations, and anomalies that could be compared to existing dental records. Each finding eliminated a possibility. No finding provided certainty. The list of candidates narrowed. Dozens became tens. Tens became a handful. But they still didn't have a name. I find this process almost sacred, the patience required, the refusal to guess. Each bone fragment treated as if it still belonged to someone waiting to be called by name. Parallel to lab work, archival research continued. POW transfer logs from the Philippines were reviewed line by line. Hospital records were reconsidered, including those previously dismissed as incomplete. Unit rosters were cross-referenced with shipping manifests. Names eliminated decades earlier due to misspellings were reconsidered. This phase of work proceeded at deliberate slowness. Each exclusion required justification. Each inclusion required authentication. There was no room for speculation. The task wasn't to figure out someone, but to avoid naming the wrong person. Then came DNA analysis. Mitochondrial DNA was extracted first, chosen because it survives best in degraded remains. The sequence was compared to reference samples submitted by families, some of whom had done so years earlier without preparation. Y chromosome testing was conducted where preservation allowed. Autosomal DNA added another layer of probability. No result functioned like a fingerprint. Each produced statistical likelihood. The process relied on both exclusion and confirmation. In an internal review, a DPAA scientist summarized the methodology clearly. "We don't prove who someone is," he said. "We prove who they cannot be until only one name remains." Week after week, the analysis continued. Cross-references were checked. Calculations were run again. Independent labs verified findings. The candidate pool shrank. 5 names. 3 names. 2 names. Contextual evidence clarified the picture further. Burial grouping matched remains found in a specific lost shipment. Geographic origin aligned with prisoner movements from Bataan. Timing matched the bombing of the Anura Maru. When biological data, archival records, and historical context combined, a conclusion emerged sufficiently reliable to proceed. Willibald Charles Bianchi. The identification wasn't received in jubilation. Findings were delivered with full documentation. An official report was drafted. Then came independent verification. Peer review confirmed the findings. The standard required wasn't absolute certainty, impossible in historical cases, but confidence high enough to responsibly replace unknown with a name. That threshold was met. The identification was completed on August 11, 2025. 80 years, 6 months, and 27 days after the Anura Maru sank. Someone was counting. Inside the laboratory, the moment passed quietly. A card was updated. A database entry was modified. A case file that had been unresolved for 8 decades moved to a different category. One scientist paused before submitting the final paperwork. He reread the Medal of Honor citation attached to the case file. The citation described moments of extraordinary action. The bones on the table represented years of consequence afterward. The contrast was unavoidable. Notification was made following protocol. Family members were contacted directly. The language used was careful, precise, and clear. Your relative has been identified. His remains have been found. We can tell you where he was. There were questions. There were long pauses. There were moments when no one spoke. For the family, the information finally arrived as something concrete after decades of ambiguity. Now there was a location, a process, a plan. Knowing didn't erase the waiting. It couldn't return the mother who'd lived and died without knowing this. It couldn't undo the injustice of a man buried with the word unknown. What it did was correct the record. A file marked incomplete was amended. A name separated from remains was restored. The gap between administrative language and human language narrowed slightly. The injustice remained. The Anura Maru wasn't marked as carrying POWs. Bombs fell without warning. Men who survived battle and captivity were killed by forces that didn't know they were there. Those truths didn't change. What changed was accountability. In preparation for transfer, the remains were handled one final time, not as evidence, as a person. Files were completed. Chain of custody was verified. Every step was documented. No one involved mentioned closing the case. Discovery didn't resolve the past. It corrected a specific error in it. After more than 80 years, Willibald Charles Bianchi was no longer a forgotten name. He was identified. He was found. The truth arrived not as revelation, but as achievement, earned through patience, precision, and refusal to accept that the unknown was permanent. When the DPAA officially confirmed Willibald Charles Bianchi's identity, the family crossed a threshold they'd never been permitted to reach before. For nearly 8 decades, there had been nothing to decide. No arrangements, no instructions, no place to stand. Waiting was the only action available. Once identification was formalized, waiting ended abruptly, replaced by a series of obligations demanding readiness the family didn't feel. How do you prepare for a funeral 80 years late? How do you mourn someone you never met but always missed? The first changes occurred somewhere far from Minnesota. At Manila American Cemetery, administrative preparations began to update the walls of the missing. Bianchi's name had been carved in stone decades earlier as an acknowledgement of uncertainty. Now, a rosette made of bronze was authorized to be placed beside it. The symbol was small and precise, not decorative. It carried no emotional language. It simply meant, the person named here is no longer missing. His remains have been found and identified. a family representative traveled to Manila to witness the placement. The day was hot. The stone surface absorbed heat from the sun. The letters of Bianchi's name remained the same size and shape as always, unchanged by time. When the rosette was affixed, it didn't dramatically alter the wall's appearance. It added only a single point of emphasis. The family member touched the bronze circle first, then slowly traced the carved letters, one by one, as if confirming that nothing had been moved without permission. "He's been found," someone said quietly. No one corrected the phrasing. It was accurate enough. There was no ceremony, no speeches, no attempt to turn the moment into triumph. The wall wasn't for celebrating recovery. It recorded adjustment. For the facility, the update marked a case's conclusion. For the family, it marked the beginning of a new, unfamiliar responsibility: deciding what came next. Procedures to return Bianchi's remains to the United States began almost immediately. This time, nothing was improvised. Every document carried his full name, rank, and service number. Every transfer required verification. The casket was prepared carefully, draped with a flag representing a country entirely different from the one he'd left as a young officer. An escort was assigned. The route was planned. Every movement was logged and signed. The contrast couldn't be ignored. Bianchi had left Minnesota quietly, one of many young men heading to war without much ceremony. His return was slow, careful, accompanied at every step. He returned with the clarity that death had taken from him. When the remains arrived in America, no crowd waited. No spectacle. The casket was moved carefully, the flag draped flat across its surface. Hands rested on it briefly, then withdrew. Touch was enough. Words weren't necessary. Family members gathered, people who'd never known him alive. Some had grown up hearing his name mentioned carefully, as if too much detail might reopen something fragile. Others knew him only through a single photograph in uniform, framed and passed from house to house across generations. For many, he existed more as an idea than a presence. Now they were being asked to stand together as family. There was no attempt to pretend this was a reunion. No one used language suggesting restoration. What was happening was acknowledgement, a correction of the record, a material action delayed beyond the span of a single lifetime. At the cemetery in Minnesota, the ground was cool and familiar. The land had been shaped by winters he'd never witnessed. Trees had grown while his name remained carved on a wall thousands of miles away. The casket was lowered slowly. There was time to watch it descend. Time to stand still without imagining. Time to understand that something delayed could still be done properly. The flag was folded precisely and presented to the closest relative. The gesture had been practiced, repeated countless times for others before. The words spoken were formal, following ritual. The meaning the moment held was entirely the family's. For the first time, there was a place to put flowers. For the first time, there was a marker with dates that weren't ambiguous. The injustice remained. Bianchi's mother wasn't there. She'd waited and died without knowing where her son rested. She'd checked the mailbox until walking became difficult. She'd folded official notifications into the same tin box as her son's handwritten letters. No paperwork could compensate for that loss. No ceremony could return the place she deserved to stand. Her absence wasn't softened by honor. It was present clearly beside the grave. This is what I can't reconcile. She did everything right. She never stopped asking. She never stopped waiting. And she died without an answer. After the funeral, life returned to normal. People went back to work. Children asked questions and received simple answers. The world didn't stop. It never had. But something fundamental had changed. Before identification, Bianchi's name floated without anchor. He existed as a symbol: courage, sacrifice, loss. After identification, he existed as a person who'd been taken, buried, named, and returned. In military circles, his case was discussed quietly. Not as victory, but as reminder. Honor didn't guarantee recovery. Records failed. Ships weren't marked. Systems collapsed. Identification required work extending long. After war ended, often performed by people who would never meet the affected families. His case was only one of many, but its duration gave it weight. At home, changes occurred quietly but persistently. A photograph once kept on a shelf was moved closer to the grave. Someone straightened the frame. Someone used the edge of a hand to brush dust from the stone. These gestures were ordinary, but they hadn't been performed in generations. The language changed. Instead of saying, "He was lost," family members began saying, "He's buried here." Instead of avoiding dates, they marked them. The waiting that had shaped how the family spoke about him now gave way to something heavier and more stable. The grief didn't disappear. It changed shape. Knowing where he was didn't ease the sadness. It just replaced one pain with another. Less acute, but more persistent. So did the anger. Anger that it took so long. Anger that the tools had existed for years before the work was completed. Anger that a man could survive battle and captivity only to die unrecognized and remain that way for nearly a century. These feelings weren't expressed at ceremonies. They emerged later, in kitchens, in quiet conversations, in moments when official language no longer fit. One family member said, "It shouldn't have taken 80 years. No one disagreed. The official record noted the case was resolved. But the human record didn't. It noted correction. The distinction mattered. Bianchi's return didn't change history. It didn't change what happened on the Enora Maru. It didn't change the failure to mark POW ships. It didn't change the truth that he died without knowing whether he'd ever be found. What it changed was what happened afterward. He was no longer a category, no longer just a name on a wall, no longer a medal without a grave. After the burial, the cemetery returned to quiet. Wind moved through tree branches. The headstone remained. People left gradually. One family member stayed briefly after. Others departed. They stood facing the stone, hands in pockets, shoulders held in position. After a moment, they reached out and placed their palm flat against the stone. The stone was cold, solid, present. They pulled their hand back and stepped away. For over 80 years, people had been waiting for Willibald Charles Bianchi. Now they weren't. He was where he could be found. Willibald C. Bianchi is no longer a mystery. He's remembered as a man who lived an ordinary life, made a critical choice, survived what followed, and then was forgotten by systems unable to keep his name with his remains. The Medal of Honor cannot replace a grave. It never could. Honor cannot shorten the wait, and recognition cannot replace presence. What remains, though quiet and hard-earned, is something. A name taken from a body, then returned. A family that waited longer than a lifetime. The waiting only ended when someone could say clearly and exactly, "This is him, and this is where he rests." Keep thinking about that watch, still on his wrist through everything, through Bagak, through the march, through the camps, through the ship, ticking away in the dark until it couldn't anymore. Time measured in suffering. Time measured in waiting. Time measured in scientific precision until a name could be returned to bones. 80 years is too long to wait for a grave. But at least the waiting has ended. At least someone can stand in Minnesota soil and say his name and know he hears it. At least there's a place where flowers can be left. At least Willibald Charles Bianchi is home. But Bianchi's story isn't finished, because his story isn't unique. Right now, there are more than 81,000 American service members still unaccounted for. 81,000 families still waiting. 81,000 names that haven't been reunited with remains. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency continues this work every single day. Scientists, historians, analysts, all working to bring people home. But they need support. They need resources. They need family DNA samples. They need time. If you have a family member who served and never came home, consider submitting a DNA reference sample to DPAA. It costs nothing. It might mean everything. If you want to support this mission, contact your representatives. Tell them this work matters. Tell them families are still waiting. And if this story moved you, if Willibald Bianchi's 80-year journey home means something to you, share it. Share it because there are families out there who need to know that even after decades, even after generations, people are still searching. That promises made can still be kept. That the phrase "leave no man behind" isn't just a motto. It's a commitment that continues long after the last shot is fired. Because every name on every wall deserves what Bianchi finally received: to be found, to be known, to come home. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And if you're part of a family still waiting, don't stop asking questions. Don't stop hoping. The work continues.